All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is part two of our three-part Ready, Set, Go forecasting webinar series. In last week's session, Ready, we really focused on understanding your client's true objectives and laying a strong foundation with them, upon which you'll build your forecast and ultimately your ongoing relationship with them as well. So we'll move on in today's session and we'll be focusing on the next step, using that strong foundation to build a base forecast for your client's business. So before we dive in, some quick introductions. I see some familiar faces and names here, but for anyone who I haven't worked with, my name is Rowan Eister. I head up marketing and partnerships for Fathom's US team. And I also want to reintroduce Ben Cooper, who will be sharing his strategies and processes with us today. Ben is the owner of Amplify, which is a firm that specializes in growth advisory and outsourced CFO services for small businesses. And one more note before we get started, please don't be shy about any questions that come up throughout our session today. Go ahead and send them through via the little Q&A tool in Zoom. We'll save some time for dedicated Q&A toward the end of our session, but we also have Kaylin joining from the Fathom team here, and she'll be fielding your questions as they come throughout our session. And as we go through different pieces, feel free to kind of raise your hand and send those in. All right, and from here, our agenda for today, we'll kick off with a quick recap on last week's session and what was covered there, that foundational stuff that we're building on. And then from there, Ben will touch on the mindset and what to keep in mind as you move further into building your forecast with your client. And then finally, Ben will show us how he goes through those key steps in taking the qualitative foundation, all of the stuff that we went through in our last session, and actually moving into the quantitative. So we'll start with that recap. So in our last session, we really focused on digging for the why. What gets your client excited? What's their true motivation? And what does success really look like to them outside of those really standard numbers like increasing profit? What's the thing that really gets them going? We've landed on building the success statement. So getting specific about what success looks like and setting some parameters around how you measure that, like a checkpoint and a timeline. So this is just kind of a recap on what that success statement looks like. And then finally, we gave a little bit of a tee up to today's session. And what we're really going to be exploring today is that space in between the qualitative and quantitative. And there's a lot that is covered in that arrow. The arrow kind of simplifies it, but there's a lot in there. So that's what we'll be diving into today. And with that said, Ben, do you want to kind of help us by laying the foundation of our where we are going? So I've circled points 1, 2, and 3. This is kind of covered in our first session, but yeah, I'd love to hear your explanation of this.
Yeah, now. Absolutely. So the single step between going from qualitative to quantitative, to your point, is there's a lot in that arrow, right? And so drilling down a layer deeper, I find it helpful, to break it out into a few, and you've circled steps 1, 2, and 3, which are really defining, what is the flag in the distance that we're kind of aligning everything toward. Number 2, what are the current decisions that the business owner is facing? We'll review some of the numbers in the Google Sheet before we jump into Fathom. But then thirdly, what are the historical relationships and patterns that we need to be aware of as we then take the first step into kind of making meaning out of these numbers, or connecting the dots, I guess. Right. Number 4 is really where we're going to be focusing our conversation today. And it's a big one because it's, for the first time, we're kind of not just looking at the numbers that were provided us or the information provided us, but we're actually going to begin to manipulate and change and make some decisions around how we want to, through formulas and through value rules, how we want to start building out this base extrapolation. So, if things continue as we expect, to our knowledge and to the business owner's knowledge, what could life look like? What could the business look like And the way we're going to build that, importantly, is to set ourselves up to easily be able to create scenarios, which is step number 5. We'll jump into that in the third part of this series, where we then can say, what happens if we make some decisions and results are better than we expect? Or what happens if things out of our control go, in a direction we don't want and things are worse than we expect? What are kind of the boundaries on, looking ahead into the future that really give us a feel for how things could play out? The phrase I like to use is, how do we put some boundaries on the region of darkness? Like, anybody running a business is familiar with the feeling of, I don't really know what's going to happen next month. And
Right.
so what my hope is, in going through a process and building out a picture like this, we can at least put some structure to that. We're never going to be able to read the future, but what we can do is give some confidence, some clarity, and some motivation to maybe feel more comfortable making a decision, like hiring a person, or changing the price on a unit, those sorts of things, because we can see just how good and maybe the limitation on how bad things might play out. So just a little preview of where we're heading, but really we're focusing on number 4, building out that base forecast today.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. And yeah, that's a great segue to the next point we'll get into, which is mindset. I think it's important to call out, like, all of these different parts really build on each other, and they all ask you to get a little bit more open to that uncomfortable what if, asking more questions, being comfortable, not 100% knowing every single answer already, being dynamic. So what we'll be going through today is kind of setting yourself up for getting further into being dynamic and answering the what ifs and navigating that darkness with your client. So we'll start with a touch on mindset before we dig in, and I'll let Ben take you all through some principles for this. And I think it's really important before we get into the numbers to kind of reorient ourselves around this mindset piece.
Yeah. And don't worry about trying to read every word on the screen here. We can give you the slides. Really, we just want to touch on some of these. There are 3 main points here. But as we step into the future, raise your hand if you like to feel competent or you want to impress your clients. Like, we all feel that way, right? And what we're stepping into is a little bit more of like, I'm making some decisions that I might need to answer some questions around, and it may feel really uncomfortable. So these 3 mindsets, just want to touch on briefly, just because it may be new territory, and I don't want you to give up or freak out or feel like what you feel is something that you shouldn't feel. We all feel this kind of nervousness going into some of this. So first, there's no right number. Obviously, we want things to be accurate, but if you wait to make sure every number is perfect as you build a forecast, you're never going to finish it and feel comfortable presenting it. So it's important also just to, just be honest and transparent with your clients, but the reality is they live in a world where they always feel like they're having to make some guesses around or assumptions around some unknowns. So it's not news to them that, as you're painting a picture into the future, that things might change, and they will change. The second one is, being comfortable inviting the business owner and you yourself, as you're curiously getting to know their business, asking a lot of why questions, not being afraid to bring up a lot of what if questions. For the first time, maybe the business owner doesn't just have to cross their fingers and go, I don't know if this is smart or not, but I'm just gonna, hire this person, or I don't feel comfortable, so I'm not going to hire this person. The reality is you can end up playing it too safe sometimes if you're not aware of what's possible. And so what we're talking about building in not just the base forecast, but then also a better and worst case scenario is we're helping to invite them to fail, in a future picture that doesn't have any kind of current consequences, but it can at least invite them to say, hey, could we make a scenario where what if sales go up 10% year over year? And so inviting them to just get creative about some questions that they may have never wanted to ask because they didn't have any kind of way to answer or put any kind of answer in place. So don't be afraid of the what if questions. And then thirdly, you don't need to be an expert. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but as you step into and get more comfortable with using the Fathom forecasting tool, I know, at least from my experience, that every time I do it, I'm learning something new. I'm getting a better feel for how I want to design and kind of blueprint the numbers that I'm taking from the onboarding conversation and translate them over into the driver section, apply those to the P&L. And so the best way I've learned to get better and more confident is just by doing. So the reality is it just takes some repetition and some getting comfortable with it. But resourcefulness is a great complement to curiosity. If you feel like I can figure out the solution and figure out a creative way to map this in a forecast, then I'm not afraid to be curious and ask questions that maybe new, that may force me into a new learning opportunity. So those are the 3 quick mindset pieces.
Awesome. Yeah, and those are so closely linked. I'm really thinking of that principle of, if you wait to have the numbers all perfectly set, if you wait to be a total expert and to anticipate every question or what if that you and your client may have, then you'll never get started. So just jumping in, going for it, being comfortable with some uncomfortable moments, I think is really key to all of this. So what we'll cover today, this is kind of that number 4 on our map of points 1 through 5. This is really what we're going to zero in on. So I'll pass to Ben from here, but what we'll cover is building that base forecast. So he's going to go back and show us some of that onboarding data that we gathered from the client. So when we're building out that success statement and asking questions initially, what are we gathering from them? Why is that important? And then we'll go into mapping out some formulas and kind of breaking down that data in a way that will be able to move it into Fathom. And we'll also go through drivers and micro forecasts. These are tools in Fathom that will allow you to be super dynamic as the reality plays out, and as your client sets new goals or asks new questions. How can you prepare for that? So we'll touch on that a bit too, and give a little teaser for our next session on the 30th. And I should call out while we're here, we will be skipping next week, Thanksgiving here in the States, but we'll be regrouping for part 3 on the 30th. So if you're sitting here waiting for us to get started on Thanksgiving, know that we'll be taking a hiatus, but we'll come back to that. So without further ado, Ben, I'll let you jump right in and start sharing your screen. And Absolutely. We'll go back to that client onboarding piece and kind of go from there.
And before I even share it, just as we jump in, just setting expectations, this is going to be fast and furious. So we are about to cover a whole lot of numbers. The goal is to show methodology and process as opposed to technicality, So the spreadsheet that I've created that kind of outlines this hot sauce case study that where numbers are going to be going from just the onboarding conversation all the way into Fathom. We want to give you access to that because there's just too much for you to kind of take in on a 20-minute recording here. So we want to invite you to just get familiar with the numbers and spend your own time clicking through and seeing how the formulas all fit together. We're about to cover a ton, so I just want to acknowledge that as I share my screen.
So, and I see a couple of raised hands. If you do have a question, please feel free to send it through to the Q&A and we'll address it there. And I'll let you jump in, Ben, but just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you remember, we ended the conversation last week, highlighting the answers to some of these questions that we had gathered from the onboarding conversation with a client. And you'll see just that qualitative to quantitative flow, mostly words at the top, numbers toward the bottom. And that really, kind of parallels the whole journey that we're kind of going on. We're getting a feel for what the picture on the puzzle box is and throwing all the pieces here on the table. The reality is it's important to gather as many pieces as you think you need. And you don't you may not use everything that you gather. But these are just some example questions that you can kind of walk through with the client. The reason I highlight the top section is kind of being the first half of the reason, the first numbers question, I guess, what are the current key decisions being considered? The reason I have that first as the first question, where you're going to get some answers that are more quantitative, is because a lot of times the key decisions that are being evaluated live in one place, and that's in the business owner's head. And the best way to uncover those and really drive into some of the curiosity questions about, what are you looking at? What are you seeing as the business owner? What things are you considering? Those are really important to have, in my opinion, in a conversation. I love having a Zoom call with the client where, as part of the onboarding, we're just really unpacking some of these decisions. And so I'm taking notes, trying to capture everything that they're considering and thinking about. And then some of these lower questions about changes in revenue year over year, kind of seasonality, some unit economic components, fixed period costs, like some of these pieces can be provided, as a follow-up to that conversation. They say, well, let me give you access to Shopify. I work with a lot of e-commerce businesses. A lot of times that has some of the information that I'm looking for here as far as units sold over previous periods. Sometimes it has some of the margin components, but really from a conversational standpoint, I would encourage you to try to capture at least this top section in a conversation. So for instance, the decisions that the business owner is considering here are around hiring a marketing agency, maybe introducing a subscription model to their business, people who want to buy a bottle of hot sauce every month, which I would be in that category. Should I increase my prices? I see competitors charging more for their product. I was approached by another supplier who said that they could actually cut our cost of goods component, reduce some of the variable expenses that we incur every time we produce and sell a unit. Maybe I should consider that. Also, I really want to hire a manager. It comes back to the success statement. As we're going through this, you're going to feel probably a little bit of whiplash because we are constantly needing to zoom way into numbers, zoom back out, remind ourselves what is most important here with the business owner. What do they care most about? Okay, get back in. So there's going to be a little bit of a little bit of craziness as you're kind of putting all these pieces together. And it really does parallel a little bit of like the metaphor of putting a picture, a puzzle together, where what the picture looks like and you're trying to find individual small pieces, and fit them together. But you also want to remember what the total picture looks like. So just as an example, again, you can get access to this sheet, so I'm not going to go line by line. But in general, what we're looking at here is a handful of decisions that a business owner is making, some year-over-year revenue, variable expense, fixed expense changes that will be helpful as we get into looking at these numbers playing out over future months and years. And then a breakdown of, the products that they sell and the channels that they sell those products through. So for this business, they sell a bottle of hot sauce directly to a customer, or they sell the same bottle of hot sauce for a different price to, if you look up here, I mentioned Whole Foods as an example. They're not sponsoring me, but just generally, I've worked with food product companies where they, start in the kitchen and they end up getting approached by somebody like Whole Foods or HEB or somebody, and it's an opportunity to get the same product out on a shelf, but you're having to evaluate, I sell the same product that cost me the same, dollars and cents to make, but I got to sell it at a lower price, but then maybe I can sell more through that channel. So there are tensions all over the place that that a business owner is facing that we're kind of untangling here and kind of separating. So the third way that this business is making money is by selling in bulk, essentially, to a restaurant. So if you look down this final kind of most complicated piece of this, and then we'll jump into extrapolating these over a timeline and then into Fathom. This section is kind of trying to capture when we make and sell a single unit, how much does it cost us? How much are we receiving in revenue for each unit? And how much do we get to keep from kind of a margin standpoint? So just in this example, what we have is, like I mentioned, a single bottle, and a bottle is going to be made up of the ingredients inside and the cost of the container. So in this case, we have a price per ounce of the hot sauce and then a cost of the container. So the way we end up with a cost of goods kind of variable component here is by saying we have 5 ounces at 14 cents an ounce, and then we're going to add 43 cents for a container. And then the difference with the half gallon, we're going to say 64 ounces at 14 cents an ounce plus the 43 cents per container. They're sharing the same container costs for this example. But then we have the reality that the business owner is, the retail price. They've had to choose at some point, how much do I charge? How much do I ask people to pay for my product? And so there are retail prices that they have set that allow us then to take a couple steps ahead of what we normally see in a profit and loss statement, where we see the rolled up revenue come in for a business. We're taking a couple steps ahead of that, both in the revenue section and the cost of goods section. And we're getting a feel for what's behind these numbers. Like they're essentially, at the end of the day, they're selling a certain number of hot sauce bottles for a certain price, and it's costing them a certain amount to produce those bottles. And that together gives us accumulated revenue picture and cost of goods picture. So Rowan, is that making sense so far? You're the only person I can ask if I'm making sense or if I'm talking crazy.
Yes, absolutely. And we've gotten lots of questions. People are eager to get their hands on this spreadsheet. So
Yes.
For folks that are asking, we will follow up. Those of you that have requested it so far, we'll follow up with you specifically. And if you would like a copy, just let us know in that Q&A and we'll be sure that we get that over to you.
So what we have is we've captured kind of the individual details. Now I'm going to click into the next step, which is, okay, now how do we start pulling these out over a timeline? And so in the second tab is called mapping formulas. Again, tons of numbers to look at. Oh my goodness, overwhelming. Please get access to the sheet because there's just a lot to click into and explore. But from a flow of numbers, that's really what I want you to get a feel for. Essentially, we're looking at, there's a certain amount of money that we could spend on marketing that the agency has said, hey, here's the budget we want to spend. We think we can acquire customers, subscribers at a certain acquisition cost, and then we start building a subscriber base that every month we're getting that revenue from. Well, also we know that we have a revenue per unit that we also want to continue out into the timeline. There's a cost of goods component. These 14 cents, 43 cents, these should look familiar. We have the cost of goods per unit, gross margin. So this is kind of helping us ultimately get down to what I was just mentioning, which is how do all these things kind of flow together to get us to a accumulated revenue forecast first, and then also accumulated cost of goods forecast. And so the way these are multiplying together ultimately are, like I mentioned before, it's the number of units at a certain price that we expect to sell, and we'll bring in that much revenue. Same with the cost of goods. We have the cost of goods per unit, selling a certain number of those units. And so we're kind of starting to get a feel for what it costs from a variable expense standpoint. Now, I highlighted some of these rows orange because as we're thinking about how we want to build out the growth forecast and get from step 4 to step 5, and that, how do we create different scenarios and say, well, maybe things could get better or things could get worse. These are some of the important variables that we want to have built out in Fathom in a way that we can make adjustments to. So ultimately, we have this flow of information. I'm going to click over to Fathom now and show you that there's the same kind of flow of information. All these numbers and all these sections should look just the same as what I have mapped out here within Google Sheets. So I've kind of created a blueprint that allows me to, and again, this is one of those technical steps that you can, there's a help article that can get you, to this place where you're able to import all of these rows and values. And this third tab is kind of the template translation of what I just built in tab number 2 to tab number 3, where everything, again, it should look familiar, that we have the driver names, we have a category, we have kind of unit of measure, all these things, and it's the same information. So I know there's a ton to look at here and there's a ton to cover here, but what we're trying to get a feel for is how did, these individual pieces, these are kind of edge pieces of a puzzle that somebody's giving us, and some of them are corner pieces, and we're now having to fill in, and make some decisions about how do these, unit sales over the last 12-month period, how are those going to flow into the future? And will the relationship of the variable expenses, the cost of goods, will that be the same, or are those going to change? So I know we just covered a lot. Rowan, do you have any input before I jump over to Fathom and start playing around in the platform?
No, this is great. I think we've got some great questions, and I think they'll be best spent in our Q&A time. So yeah. I've got a couple that I'll reserve. But no, I think we're tracking well.
Awesome. Okay, so now we're in Fathom. Now we have the same flow of information. So we've got all the bits of data. The zooming in, zooming out piece I was talking about, one of the main things that they said matters is, well, actually, before I jump into that, I do want to show the kind of one of the main outputs of the way all of these formulas are built together. And you'll see kind of the same as in the Google Sheet. It's the number of units sold times revenue per unit gets us, a value here of revenue. And then the way I've set this up is to have in the profit and loss, these 3 revenue lines be referencing that driver. So it allows me to make sure that my underlying formulas, you can also build the same formula out of the drivers here. I just literally made a formula that just references, almost like in Excel, it just references a driver line. But we can do that for the revenue. And then because cost of goods is kind of accumulation of all 3 different types of revenue streams and the different units, I have that referencing the summed up cost of goods that I have down here. I also want to encourage, be creative with how you structure things. What I don't want you to do is try to mimic or recreate exactly how I have things structured here. Every business is different. Every business is unique. So some of the ways things are structured here pertain to a food product type business who's introducing a subscription. And so this isn't a formula that every business needs to be, thrown through. And really, that's to me the difference between having a relationship and a transaction with a client, is that you are not just sending them through a checklist of, and then I'm going to create this driver every time, and then I'm going to create this kind of report every time. It's the customizing and it's the tailoring that makes the relationship come alive, because people realize, oh, those are my numbers that you're working with. That's so exciting. So I just wanted to highlight that, the driver section from a revenue and variable expense standpoint is flowing into the P&L in this way. Now, one of the other pieces here that I want to touch on, they mentioned that fixed expenses year over year growing by 16%. So one of the assumptions that we can make, or one of the global rules that we can apply to this section of expenses is actually creating a rule that just says, hey, we think 16% year over year, these expenses are going to grow. And so as a result, then we see that shape kind of continuing at a 16% year over year clip. And that's just to, again, continue to help us extrapolate based on what we know today, we can extrapolate this picture into the future. Some of these other, if people have questions, some of these other line items in revenue, cost of sales, like some of these are just smart prediction, which I love. It's a helpful way to just get a quick, like, let Fathom look at some of the past numbers and begin creating a baseline picture. So an important piece that I want to highlight is, hey, this business owner is thinking about a couple of different decisions. So I'm going to click into the roadmap. In the roadmap, we see first the decision to hire a marketing agency. What I have here essentially is just the $1,500 expense that they are incurring. This is just in line with I included it here just mostly as a visual for us to remember that this is a decision that is starting January of 23. The second big decision is hiring a manager. Going back to their success statement, they're saying, this would be really important for me to hire somebody. When can I afford to do that? And so where I find it to be really helpful is to look at the metrics down here and start to look at, okay, when does operating profit allow us to absorb a new expense? And they mentioned it's 54 grand a year, and that's what it's going to cost us. Well, looking into the numbers, we can see that, well, actually it's not just the base salary, but there are also benefits and payroll taxes that we need to consider as well. So the net effect is more like 5 grand a month that we need to kind of be thinking about. And so as a starting point, what I find helpful is to say, look, okay, we want to make sure that there is a adequate flow of dollars available for us to justify a big decision like this. So in the base picture, what I decided to do is just say, hey, we want to make sure that we're bringing in at least twice what this new expense is. So I said 10,000 a month. I want to set that as a metric. And so what that allows us to do is begin to look at, based on the things we know to be true about the numbers that were provided us, we can start to drag this around and we can see, okay, here's this hiring decision. When would it make sense? We don't like that because we're negative. I like getting it far out in the future enough to start seeing, like, okay, where do we start consistently passing that threshold that we want to be past? And so it looks like July is kind of the point where we can maybe safely make that decision and move forward with it. Now, the reality is we know that this is just the base decision. And so the exciting piece kind of rolls into what step number 5 in this whole process is going to allow us to do, which is start to look at different growth scenarios. So the way that we have built out the driver section, I highlighted those orange cells, we created all those formulas. That's not just for the sake of creating a bunch of formulas. It's so that when we sit with the business owner and we say, hey, I know you were thinking about what would happen if we increase our prices? What if we hire a person? What if we could save some money? What if we roll out a subscription model? We can start to then provide simplicity back on the other side of, like, the hyper complex building out of all these formulas and the rows of numbers. I know that, I've never met a business owner who would go to the extent of building out all of the drivers. And in my experience, the business owners are so busy focusing on running their own business and solving their own problems, and they don't necessarily feel confident in their ability to understand how to even build out a basic picture of what their business could look like, especially as you start making some conceptual decisions about moving into the future. So it can be not just, I said it can be daunting for us, but if you're watching this, you're probably, steps ahead of where an average business owner would be in their comfort level of building out something like this. But this is where we're heading. We are moving toward providing a simplified picture. What we just kind of put together, and I know it's like, again, fast and furious, we just threw a bunch of numbers and steps in the process at you, but this blue line is really what we have mapped out here. And this is, revenue, we have operating profit, cash on hand. These are just some examples of what we're going to be able to look at in part number 3, where we can actually begin to show, okay, business owner, if things play out this way, it's not just that you can hire that manager in July. You might be able to hire them in May, April, March, like things, so we can start to move things around in the picture and help them start feeling like they're able to be proactive with their business decisions, as opposed to just going, I think I'm just gonna do what I did last month because it didn't run the business into the ground. And that's the kind of opportunity that I see here, is the business owner saying, I'm unstuck. Thank you. I'm no longer just stuck on the hamster wheel, like repeating month over month, feeling helpless about, when or how should I make some of these future facing decisions.
Yeah. Yeah. Start to open up the world of exploring the what ifs,
Yeah.
and doing so courageously, without just, the pure discomfort and hesitation. Thank you so much, Ben. So from here, we'll move into Q&A, and we had some great questions come through during as you were going through these different pieces, Ben. So the first one that I want to start with, kind of chronologically, we had a couple of questions around that initial kind of intake form, I would call it. You might have a better name for it, but that initial Google sheet where, the first top is pretty conversational, and that's where you really get the quality information from the business owner or the team. And the second half is a little more numbers based. It might come from systems, but it's giving you a picture of where that business has been and what's on the table for them. So obviously this is a commerce business, but how would we got some questions around other industries, and I'm thinking that you might have a take on that, kind of how you'd use this, or if it changes. Obviously, not every business is going to have a bottle and hot sauce. No. But what are kind of the key pieces? How do you make that flexible for other types of clients?
It's a great question. And this is where the resourcefulness pairs with the curiosity, because what I put together here is an example of a physical product, a consumable with a subscription component, and that's not every business, that's not many businesses, but there are moving parts there that at least can show from a procedural standpoint how we can think about creatively putting ourselves in the shoes of the business owner and saying, okay, how does this business make money? How does this business create value? If you're a service-based business, for instance, it might be that you generate a certain amount of revenue per hour and you bill clients hourly, or you have a certain number of monthly retainers that you might have in place at a certain revenue amount. And then, if you're hiring people to deliver that value, then maybe there's the cost of goods in that scenario may be a contract or kind of a payroll component that is a percentage of, I've done work with a therapy business, and so the number of visits or encounters that are expected to happen at a certain amount of revenue every month, and how much does the therapist get paid out of that revenue, and what are the operating expenses, and how does marketing in a service-based business drive new dollars in revenue. There are patterns and there are types of industries, and at the end of the day, it's just a matter of getting comfortable with how you can take the bits of information and map them out in a way that you know can be translated into the Fathom world. Because once you know that um, every business I've created a growth plan for has looked different. Like there's just realities that, well, this one's different. Even similar industries, they're just different components at play. So some of it is just saying, okay, well, I understand how they make money. That's the first step. I understand what it costs them to create that value. So that's almost like a variable expense component. And then I understand how those two components kind of play out over time. That's a big part of it. Once you outline that, at some point you're just kind of filling in the gaps there and getting a feel for it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it is about just asking good questions and saying, oh, okay, that's interesting. I mean, I honestly, I've done this so many times, and I learn something new every time I unpack the inner workings of a business in that first. So again, it's what I was saying. Please don't just copy the questions even, and don't copy the sheet and say, every onboarding conversation I have, I just need to fill in all of these cells. It's just going to look different for every business.
Right. Yeah. Be prepared for it to not be the
Yes.
same in any of those
And
conversations.
don't freak out when it's different. Like
Right.
it's just like the best thing we can do is from an empathy, almost like an empathy standpoint. Like if I were in the shoes of the business owner, what would be important for this person who is helping me map out a growth plan? What would be important for them to know? And
Right.
as much as we can put ourselves in their shoes, that solves a lot of it.
Yeah. 100%. Awesome. One more question. I just thought this was a good one. A totally fair question. If we're creating all the mapping in a Google Sheet or in Excel, what is the advantage of then bringing it into Fathom? And I think that you answered some of this, bringing us through like
Yeah.
that business roadmap with the colored moving
Yeah.
pieces. But yeah, can you speak more to what benefits you've seen in, you're doing this work outside of Fathom, but then why is it worth it to then bring it into Fathom?
There are two main reasons. And the first one is that the actual results from the business are connected right into Fathom, through the accounting software. So importantly, when another month ends or another month closes, so what we just looked at in the Google Sheet, like, hey, cool, that's meaningful this month, and I can show a business owner that, and it will get them the same kind of excitement, hopefully, about what's possible in the future. But where it fails is over time, the burden of updating and somehow importing actual, results month over month, that becomes a burden that is solved by, each month just kind of rolling with the same forecasted plan that we put together from new starting points. That's a huge part of it. And then the second piece of it is, Rowan, like you mentioned, really the biggest benefit is going to, of all the work that I just showed mapping out, the biggest payoff is going to be in the next episode of what we're covering here,
Right.
because that's a lot of work to build out a base forecast. But I'll tell you what's like a nightmare amount of work is trying to quickly update alternate scenarios and remember which version of which Excel file or Google Sheet was saved and what number I changed and where. And so like even the simple thing I showed of dragging the timing of hiring somebody,
Right.
and that's just one of what could be a good number of decisions that are mapped out in the roadmap. To be able to have those quickly available for even during a client conversation, to be able to drag those around and create a new scenario, but just change one of the driver values and say, well, what if year over year we're changing, revenue is increasing by 40% instead of 20%, and quickly being able to provide that insight in the moment. It means that I don't have a 3-hour project waiting for me after the call ends where I have to go do a bunch of manual updates to a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and that is a perfect segue. I know a couple more questions came through, and we will follow up with you if you had questions. We'll also follow up with everyone who asked for that spreadsheet and recordings. Everyone who registered for this webinar and the series on the whole will get recordings of each session. So we aren't going to leave you hanging. Anyone that's raised their hand with questions or requests, we'll follow up with you individually. But that is a great kind of teaser for our next session. Again, we'll be breaking next week, and then we'll regroup on the 30th for our final iteration of this series, Go. Arguably the super exciting part. So yeah, just as Ben was saying, being able to stay dynamic and not be stuck in a super static forecast that's really complex, but
Right.
it's not changing with your business. It's not allowing those what if questions.
Yep.
And also being able to communicate insights and implications of what ifs or different opportunities to your client in a way that they can really make sense of. In some of those visual tools that you showed us, Ben, is kind of a sneak peek of what we'll get into there. So those are the core components.
There might be some curveballs here next, like in the sense of we're going to kind of fast forward 90 days and see, oh, there's some things that we didn't know at the time when we built out the plan, just because things are always changing. And so,
that's life.
So you got to tune in for, that's a teaser. And then also on our off week, just put some hot sauce on your food. Just think about, just keep the momentum going, but eat some hot sauce.
Perfect. Love that advice. All right. Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time. And for anyone that missed out on our first session, or if you can't make it to the 30th, again, we'll get everyone recordings of all 3 sessions, but feel free to get in touch if any other questions come up. Hopefully this got you thinking on possibilities and what ifs of things that you can do with your clients. So more to come. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.